Story 1. I wasn't supposed to be working the late shift that night at St. John's Hospital, but a colleague of mine called in sick, and I was asked to cover. It seemed like just another quiet night. Just me, the emergency department, and the usual few patients trickling in with minor injuries. Nothing prepared me for what was about to unfold. Around midnight, the hospital felt unnervingly quiet. The emergency room had emptied out, save for a few sleeping patients in the waiting area. I took a moment to collect myself, drinking stale coffee, trying to keep my eyes open. That's when I noticed something odd. The hallway leading to the hospital's intensive care unit, the ICU, was dark. The lights in that section often flickered, but tonight it was pitch black. I figured they were just doing maintenance work though. It wasn't uncommon for parts of the hospital to be under renovation. But then I heard something, a faint scraping sound, followed by a cough, a deep, wet, choking kind of cough. I froze, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. The sound seemed to come from the ICU wing, and that was strange. The ICU was supposed to be locked down and monitored. No one was supposed to be in there unless they were a patient or staff. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the dimly lit corridor. As I approached the ICU entrance, the sound grew louder, followed by a strange shuffling noise, like someone dragging their feet. I called out, thinking someone might be there, maybe a janitor or someone who got lost. But there was no answer. I reached the door and tried the handle. Locked. I sighed in relief, telling myself it was probably just the wind or some odd sound bouncing around in the empty hallway. But then I heard it. A loud bang from inside, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. That was enough to make my heart race. I rushed to the security desk to check the cameras. When the monitor flickered to life, I immediately noticed something that chilled me to the core. On the camera feed, I saw the ICU door wide open. No one was there, but the shadows inside seemed to move. My stomach churned. I wasn't about to ignore it. I had to check it out. And I figured the security guard, an older man named Joe, could back me up if anything went wrong. He agreed, and we both made our way down to the ICU. When we arrived, the door was still open. The silence was suffocating. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting long shadows across the corridor. As we stepped inside, I could see that the lights in the ICU were flickering intermittently, casting strobe-like shadows across the walls. The monitors were all on, blinking steadily, but no one was in their beds. The room was completely empty. "Well, this is weird," Joe muttered, peering around. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. That's when I saw it. A blood stain, small but unmistakable, near one of the patient beds. My mind raced. Was it from a patient who had bled out? But the stain was fresh. It hadn't dried yet. I turned to Joe, who was now looking down the hallway, his expression blank. "Joe, we need to call someone. This isn't right." But when I looked back at him, I realized something was wrong. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and his mouth hung slightly open. "Joe, I asked, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. He didn't respond. Instead, he pointed down the hallway, his hand trembling. I followed his gaze, and I saw her. At the far end of the hallway, standing motionless in a room full of shadows, was a woman. Her hospital gown was soaked in dark red, and her eyes were wide and vacant, staring directly at us. She had no face, just smooth, pale skin where it should have been. The lack of features made my blood run cold. "Joe," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We need to go, right now." But he didn't move. His feet were rooted to the spot, his body trembling as though he was paralyzed. The woman started to move toward us, her steps slow, deliberate, dragging her feet across the floor in a way that should have been impossible. Every step she took left behind a faint trail of blood. I grabbed Joe's arm and pulled him, but he wouldn't budge. "She's here," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on her. She's real." The woman's head tilted slightly, and I heard a soft, raspy voice, a voice that sounded like it came from under the earth. "You shouldn't have come." Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold wind rush past us, like a gust of breath on the back of my neck. I turned and ran. Joe screamed behind me, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare turn around to see what was happening. The only thing I knew for sure was that whatever was in that ICU, whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. I burst through the emergency room doors, gasping for breath. When I turned back to check on Joe, he wasn't behind me. The next day, Joe was gone. He never came back to work. No one knew where he went. The hospital security footage from that night was erased. And now, every time I walk through St. John's, I swear I see her, standing in the corner of a room, her face just barely visible in the shadows, waiting. Story 2. It was one of those nights where the silence in the hospital felt almost unnatural. The kind of silence that presses down on you, a heavy weight that makes you question every creak in the floorboards or flicker of the lights. I'd been working at Nightshade Memorial for just over a month, covering the night shifts in the less populated areas of the building, the ones that had been shut off from the public for years. The hospital wasn't old, but there were parts of it that still felt like relics of another time. That night, I was assigned to monitor a single patient in a forgotten section of the hospital, room 514. The room was in a wing that had long since been deemed underused by most staff. It wasn't a designated ICU, but they sometimes put patients there if they didn't need immediate intensive care. The hospital had been trying to repurpose the old wing for storage, but every so often, a patient would get assigned to one of the rooms. The patient in question was Mr. Howard, a middle-aged man who'd been admitted after a sudden stroke. His condition was stable, but he'd been unresponsive for days, and the doctors were unsure when or if he'd wake up. He had no family left. His wife had died a few months earlier, and his estranged son lived across the country. I knew this because I'd briefly glanced at his medical chart when I arrived for my shift. His case wasn't urgent, and the nurses had taken care of the basics before I was assigned to watch over him. The room itself felt odd. It was clean, sterile, of course, but there was a peculiar chill to it, like the air conditioning had been running on overdrive. The lights above flickered occasionally, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. It was one of those spaces where the quiet was almost too loud, too suffocating. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling that something was off, but the longer I stayed, the more I felt like something was watching me. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed the shift. I was sitting at the nurse's station just outside his room, doing my rounds on my phone to pass the time. Suddenly, I heard it, the faintest sound of something shifting, the rustle of bedsheets. I thought maybe Mr. Howard had moved, but when I checked, he was still lying completely still, his eyes shut, his chest rising and falling slowly with each breath. I dismissed it as my imagination, but when I turned to leave the room, I noticed something strange. The window. There was no way to explain it. The blinds had been fully drawn when I entered, but now they were half open, the faintest sliver of moonlight creeping through. I remember wondering if I'd done it subconsciously when I went to check on him, but that didn't seem right. I was sure I'd left the blinds closed. I went over to adjust them, and as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection on the glass. My heart skipped. In the mirror-like surface of the window, I saw him, Mr. Howard, standing behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The bed was empty. He was gone. Panic shot through me like electricity. I checked the entire room again, my hands trembling. No sign of him anywhere. I opened the door to the hallway, but it was empty too. The hospital felt impossibly quiet. No one was around, not even the usual late-night janitors or security personnel. I went back to his room. I couldn't help but think that maybe my exhaustion was playing tricks on me, but there was no denying the cold, sinking feeling in my gut. I tried to shake it off, checking his vitals once more, reassuring myself that everything was normal. But that was when I noticed the first truly disturbing detail, the heart monitor. It wasn't showing a flat line anymore. It was alive. The spikes on the screen were irregular, but they were definitely there. His pulse, however faint, was returning. I stepped back, my head spinning. This couldn't be possible. Mr. Howard had been unresponsive for days, and the doctors had said his chances of waking up were slim to none. The heart monitor beeped softly, as if in confirmation of my thoughts. I checked his vitals again, but the monitor seemed to be malfunctioning. Then I saw it. At the foot of his bed, there was a figure standing in the shadows, almost invisible, except for the silhouette. I froze. It wasn't Mr. Howard. This thing was taller, its shape far more menacing. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face, if you could call it a face, was nothing but a dark blur, like the outline of a person trapped in a fog. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me. "Mr. Howard?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. But it didn't respond. It didn't speak at all. Instead, it tilted its head as though considering me. A cold, suffocating dread washed over me, and I couldn't move. It was like my limbs had turned to stone. I wanted to scream, to run, but something inside me held me still, my breath shallow and uneven. The figure began to shift, slowly moving toward me. Every step it took was deliberate, dragging itself like it was made of something other than human flesh. I could see now that its skin was as black as night, with what looked like faint patterns, veins perhaps, writhing underneath the surface. The air around it was impossibly cold, and I could feel the temperature drop with every step it took. I reached for the door, but my hand couldn't find the handle. It was as though the very air had turned to stone. The figure grew closer, and I could hear it breathing, gasping, like it was starved for air. Then, as it had finally made its decision, it lunged at me, its fingers long and bony, reaching for my throat. I broke free from the paralysis, screaming as I shoved past it, slamming into the door. I bolted out into the hallway, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I just ran. I never went back to that wing again. The next morning, when I told my supervisor what had happened, he just shook his head. "You were probably just hallucinating," he said, dismissing me like it was nothing. But I know what I saw. That night, I was the last one to leave. And when I passed the ICU again, I swear I saw him, Mr. Howard, standing by the window in room 514, staring out into the darkness. I didn't look back. Story 3. I had always thought of myself as a logical person, someone who didn't easily succumb to the pull of fear. I worked as a night nurse at the Grandview Hospital, one of the busiest in the city. And while most people dreaded the late shifts, I had grown accustomed to it. The hospital's long, sterile hallways became familiar to me, the quiet hum of the machines and the soft beeping of monitors, almost comforting in their predictability. But one night, everything changed. It started off like any other. The usual stream of minor injuries and patients needing routine checks. I made my rounds, checking in on those in the ICU, making sure everything was running smoothly. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that things began to get unsettling. I'd been assigned to the psychiatric wing for a few nights due to short staffing. There was a patient, a woman named Sarah, who had been admitted a few weeks ago after a violent outburst in her apartment. She had a history of mental illness, but her behavior had been increasingly erratic. That night, she was particularly quiet. Too quiet. When I entered her room, I noticed she was sitting in her bed, facing the corner, completely still. Her posture was rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It wasn't typical behavior for her. Normally, she was either agitated or screaming, but tonight she was eerily calm. The lights in her room flickered briefly, casting a sickly glow on her pale face. "Sarah?" I called out softly, trying to get her attention. She didn't respond. I stepped closer. Her eyes, wide and glossy, slowly shifted to meet mine. But there was something wrong about them. The pupils were unnaturally dilated, and there was a strange, unsettling intensity in her gaze. I felt a chill run through me, but I chalked it up to the hours and fatigue. "You need to take your meds," I said, my voice more firm this time. She simply nodded, but didn't say a word. I helped her take the pills, and when I left her room, I felt relieved, thinking maybe she was just having one of those days. But the further I walked down the hallway, the more I felt something wasn't quite right. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The silence was thick, and it was as if every sound, every breath I took, was amplified in the stillness of the hospital. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping. At first, I thought it was just a door closing, or maybe someone in the nearby rooms shifting. But then it came again. Closer this time. A slow, deliberate tapping, like someone's fingernails dragging across the walls. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from the direction of the patient rooms. It was coming from the empty hallway behind me. I turned, my pulse quickening, but there was nothing there. Just the long stretch of hallway, empty and dark, the pale light casting long shadows across the floor. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I kept walking, but the tapping grew louder, more frantic. It was as if something or someone was moving just behind me. I spun around again, my heart pounding now. Still nothing. I was alone, but the tapping didn't stop. It was getting closer and closer. My breath hitched in my throat. I quickened my pace, moving faster through the hallways, but the sound of tapping followed me, echoing with each step I took. That's when I heard it. A voice, low, raspy, almost like a whisper. "You can't run. It's already here." I stopped dead in my tracks, the blood draining from my face. It wasn't Sarah. The voice was too deep, too malevolent. I turned on my heels, racing toward the nurse's station. I burst through the doors, breathless, frantic, but the night staff was already gone. The security guards had left their post hours ago. I was alone. A glance at the security monitors showed nothing out of the ordinary. No one had entered the hospital from the outside. No movement in the halls. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the lights above flickered, and the entire floor seemed to darken. The tapping was back, but this time it was much louder, more distinct. It was right behind me. I spun around, but once again, nothing was there. Then, without warning, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold, as if a draft had rushed through the room. I could see my breath in front of me, swirling in the frozen air. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart across the hallway. It wasn't the shape of a person, it was something other. Tall, thin, and formless. I heard the voice again, this time clearer, almost mocking. "Turn around, you're next." I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. My legs felt like lead, my heart racing as I slowly turned toward the hallway, my eyes scanning the darkness. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the corridor. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs twisted in grotesque angles. Its face, I couldn't make out the details, but it was there, staring. The empty space where its eyes should have been seemed to darken the hallway around it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The shadow began moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. Each step it took made the room grow colder, the air thicker. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the sound of my own rapid breathing filling the silence. I ran to the nearest exit, not looking back once. I bolted through the hospital's main doors, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air. The next day, I came back in to finish my shift, but Sarah's room was empty. Her bed was stripped, the sheets freshly changed. When I asked about her, no one seemed to remember her name. No one knew who she was or why she had been admitted. And when I looked through the hospital's records, there was no mention of her at all. I don't work the night shift at Grandview anymore. Every time I pass by the hospital now, I feel like it's watching me. The shadow, the thing that followed me, I can still hear its voice echoing in my mind. You're next.